The real Jesus being born June the 26th, not December the 25th, Yeshua, because there are three different people that have been known as Jesus in the Bible. We say Santa, yeah, Santa. You can actually make that into Satan. Remember, it's an anagram. The red that Father Christmas is wearing is one of the lowest vibration, or in terms of when you look at your chakras, which deals with gluttony. This is why he's obese, or he's got a lot of weight. Chimney, which deals with fire, yeah, red fire. You look at how it ties into fire worship, which ties into where I'm saying the Samhain comes from, which is the Wicca. A bat is actually a combination of bird and rat. Before we get into the wise men, we kind of have to build up to it, because the three wise men come about during the time when Jesus Christ is being born, according to the biblical text. And these three wise men, they come and they basically follow a star to where Jesus is being born, and they bring gifts and so on. But we're in this time now where we're going into Christmas, right? And when you think about Christmas and how it's going to tie into the wise men, you know that you hear this a lot, right? Ho, 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 right? Which is really where Father Christmas comes into the picture, right? And he says this ho, ho, ho. What they really need to do is add two more letters to the end of that, yeah? Ho, ho, hoax, because there's a lot of hoax, right? So we're going to kind of go into that. So you have to remember that before Christmas, you will have like Halloween. The roots of Halloween are in coming from like Wicca and the Druids, and it's really a celebration of something known as Samhain, yeah, Samhain. Again, remember with Wusabat, we ask you to do your research, check everything out, because the Samhain celebration is really coming from Wicca, and Samhain is referred to as the Lord of the Dead. And so this word Sam becomes Uncle Sam, right? Uncle Sam. And when you say Uncle Sam, a lot of people relate Uncle Sam to America. This is one of the names that America is referred to as Uncle Sam. But this Sam also becomes Samuel, yeah? Which translates as poison dose of El. Why do we say poison? Because in Arabic, you're dealing with Samum, okay? And Samum is referring to the poison. That's why when we say poison dose of El, it's referring to that poison where when somebody is upset, they huff and they puff and they get it's referred to as Narin Samun in Arabic, yeah? So all of this ties into the occult. It ties into what we call, like, in terms of Halloween anyway, you got, goblins, you got witches, vampires, because when you really think about the whole thing, and children going out to get sweets and all of that, it's like sweets are not good for you anyway, because it gives you bad teeth and you get like, cavities and things like that. Ties into Dracula, right? Because it's all about scaring people, and Dracula ties into the vampires in terms of drinking blood. And it all goes into, like I said, when you start to deal with Satanists, because the 666 tying into the Church of Satan, because this is how we're going to start getting into the Christmas thing. Because when you look at, we say Santa, yeah, Santa, yeah. If you really look at that, you can actually make that into Satan. Remember, it's an anagram. You can move letters around and tie it back into Satan, because 666, the devil's number, Satan. There was actually a church that was sanctioned in 1966, right? There's the Church of Satan, the Church of Satan, and it was sanctioned by Ronald Wilson Reagan. And the person who started his church, or got the license from Ronald Wilson Reagan, was Anton, you can research all of this, Anton LaVey. Yeah, so there's an actual church of Satan that ties into all of this that I'm saying. So we're going from Halloween, and then The next thing is Christmas. And obviously, when you're dealing with like Halloween, what are the kind of animals you think about? You think about owls, yeah? The owl. The owl is something that people are scared of. You look at what? The bat. When you look at a bat is actually a combination of bird and rat. That's what forms a bat. But these two, bats, owls, they're nocturnal, so they can see in the dark, which ties into the Bohemian Grove, Moloch, where they go and they, worship this big owl in the Bohemian Grove. And so I'm just building up to tell you how when you get to what we're calling Christmas and this ho hoax, because it's talking about Jesus, right? What does December the 25th, which is when Christmas is celebrated, yeah? What has December the 25th got to do with the birth of Jesus and these three wise men coming? Because December the 25th, if you're looking at the weather and so on, that's dealing with winter time, okay? The birth that they're celebrating, what has that got to do with Santa? What's that got to do with Christmas? Because Christmas, it's really a manufactured thing. And they will say Christ, yeah, because they're tying Christmas to Christ. And Christ is being born on December the 25th. And then this is why Christmas is being celebrated. And then you got Santa, right, who comes in, is dressed in red. He's obese because he's got a lot of weight on him. And this ties into the whole, when you say Christ and mass, the masses, yeah, the masses of people that are supposedly celebrating the birth of Christ, which, did they exist? Did they not exist? And the red that Father Christmas is wearing is what? It's one of the lowest vibration, or in terms of when you look at your chakras, which deals with gluttony. This is why he's obese, or he's got a lot of weight. And why is he coming down the chimney, which deals with fire? Yeah, red fire. You look at how it ties into fire worship, which ties into where I'm saying this Samhain comes from, which is the Wicca, yeah? Wicca religion of the Celts, right? And Celts is spelled in many ways. Celts, and Celts, yeah? Which becomes, you got Celtics, Celtics, and Celtics as well, right? Anyway, so this is all building up to this celebration, and the elves, right, in the story of Father Christmas, he's on this, he comes with reindeers, and he's got all these elves. The elves are really the manufacturers, because when I say the whole hoax, it's about selling. All the businesses around this time of year, they make more money than they make through the whole year, because the campaigning and the advertising is constantly in your face. And remember, Halloween was what? Around October. And then straight after that, that's when you get the bombardment of the advertising from October all the way into December, which is Christmas. And then after that, you get January, which is the new year. And if you look at the Church of Satan, and they have a calendar, and this calendar, right, has all these holidays in, and these, as we've broken down many times, these celebrations that we're partaking in, like Christmas, then it's going to be the New Year, then it's going to be Valentine's Day, then it's like Easter. It's like in the calendar, there is a celebration which goes right back into these Celtic practices of Samhain, which have weaved their way into religion, all right? So we say the masses of Christians are celebrating the birth of Christ. And this is interesting because right now, there's a lot of talk of a black Jesus. And when you look at, we're going to show you some images, like Putin has exposed and said that, Jesus was black. Then you've got the Pope saying it. This is something that is going on right now. But when you look at the images that they're giving you, Because some people be like, oh, Jesus is not black. He was Mediterranean because the area where he was born is like the people there are not black or they're not white. But the images they're showing you right now on the internet, on social media, are black. But one thing you will see is they keep showing him with straight hair. They don't show you the real picture of Yeshua. Remember, I said Yeshua because there are three different people that have been known as Jesus in the Bible, and this is where the confusion comes in, because you have the real one, which is referred to as Yeshua, the son of Mary, yeah, and the angel Gabriel. We say the angel Gabriel because Gabriel came down and he took the form of a man. Go back and read the story. He took the form of a man and then he went in onto her, and it says that she's chosen from amongst all the women. And when you start to look at that story, because she had a male child, scientifically, a woman cannot deliver and give birth to a child, a male child, without a Y chromosome, right? So X is female, XY deals with male. And that Y is really a defective X because it originally was an X, but the male got maimed. So an X has more material scientifically. And when you look at a male and a female, although the male will have the same things that a female has, such as mammary glands, but they are of no use, whereas the female will use them, to breastfeed, etc. So when we go into the story of who is born on the 25th, that date's actually referring to a person called Nimrod, right? Nimrod, who becomes known as Nimrod, yeah? Nimrod is born on that 25th of December, and his mother's name is Semiramis, okay? This is all important because the story that they give you of Christmas, I want to make it clear that Christmas and the birth of Jesus and the wise men coming are kind of two different stories being interchanged, because with the Christmas, you have the elves are the manufacturers that are using Christmas to advertise, to sell you all kinds of stuff, and they make all kinds of, products. And during this time of the years when everyone pretends to be, not everyone, but the majority of people, they buy a lot of food because it deals with having their big feast and toys and all of that. So it's conveniently these pagan rituals, because this is where, the pagans, the Celtics, they had a lot of pagan rituals which result with Samhain, because that celebration was, they did a lot of things like sacrificing and all that. Go and research the Samhain celebration, all right? So let's get back to the wise men. So Nimrod is born on the 25th of December, which is a winter season, and the real Jesus was born in summer, right, in June. And so there's a contrast in terms of this whole thing with Christmas, the masses of Christ, Santa, the Church of Satan, and you're dealing with all these rituals that have wound them way into Christmas when it really has nothing to do with Christmas. Now, even the pictures you see of, like the baby Jesus with the mother, that comes back from the story of Nimrod, because what happened is that Nimrod was a mighty hunter, was the son of Cush, and he was ruling over Babylon or Babel, where, they were building the tower, yeah, the tower, which was trying to communicate with God in the heavens according to the story. But we know that that tower was a device, yeah, he was basically like building an aerial or an antenna so that they could communicate directly with Nibiru. He wanted to speak directly to Anu and bypass Enlil and Enki, because Enlil and Enki, they were basically controlling the people by sending frequencies and controlling their mind, like what's happening today. You get a lot of frequencies by way of marketing, advertising, etc. And if mentally you're not ready and know what's going on, you get influenced because they're telling you, buy this, buy that, this is good for you. And so when Nimrod, he went to Africa, and as I said, he was the son of Cush, and he was taught the language, right, which we know today as Mispatia or Nwapit. And when he came back, what he was able to do is teach his people that language. You can find the story in Genesis chapter 11. He was teaching the people that language, and when they started to speak that language, they started to use their own mind. So they were able to block these frequencies from, from the Anunnaki, from, enlil them. And he was like, now they were able to come together and work together to build this tower. And he was known as he was a mighty hunter. And so he was able to try and communicate directly with Anu. But what happened with Nimrod is that he became quite egotistical. So he went from wanting to communicate with the Most High, as it's written in the Bible, to wanting to be worshipped. And so he was told about these beings that he could control, which is dealing with these, the Canaanites. And so he wanted to rule them and control them. So what he did was he decided to get them to worship him. They started to build statues to him. And they started to build statues to him. And then eventually he got sacrificed, and his mother, Semiramis, who's actually his wife as well. The place where he was taken out, she grew a tree, right? And that tree, she told the people that he was still alive in the spirit, and that he would come and speak with her through this tree that she had planted in his memory, and was like, so people still came and believed and started to put gifts on it and worship that tree. You can find the whole of this story in the Holy Tablets. I think it's probably also in the scroll, the Fallacy of Christmas, and the Wisemen, which are pretty, scrolls the master put out a long, long time ago. But anyway, so that whole thing about the evergreen tree that grew is where you get the whole Christmas tree today from. But that, as I said, ties into the Wiccan religion and all the pagan rituals, which ties into what you're now looking at, which is a commercial thing called Christmas, which is all about manufacturing and selling you things. And tones, going back to the language, they play a significant part, because what you're looking at is, when you're looking at the manufacturing side, you've got things called what? Jingles, yeah? You all sing the Jingle Bell song. And even as I've just said that word, I'm sure you're hearing the tune in your head, right? Because this jingle it's a tone, it's a vibration, it's a frequency, which becomes, if you look at the word jinn, right, that ties into being phonetically jinn as well, which again, the jinns are these disagreeable race or species of beings, reptilian beings, which if you spelt Satan backwards, you will get the word Natas. Yeah, Natas. Natas is a species of jinn, right? Because remember, you had Jan, okay? So Jan was the head of these jinns, which goes to the story of Iblis in the Quran, who is the son of Tarnush, or Zwen, where that whole story that, you're worshiping Satan, the real Satan that you're talking about as Zwen or Zion, which is really dealing with the son of Enlil, Nana. So these songs, they get you to basically, they got all this music going on and all the advertising, all the marketing that takes you to buying things, buying Christmas trees, buying presents. And Saint Nick, right? Saint Nick, which is another name for Santa. Yes, Saint Nicholas, Saint Nick. in England, obviously, the word nick to us means what? When you're stealing, nicking something. And St. Nicholas, which, I don't want to go too far away from the Wisemen, so I'm going to come back to the Wisemen, but it all ties into the magician, Merlin, who was the person that was speaking with Nimrod as well. And Merlin ties into Hollywood, because the holly, that's a whole different thing. But the wood, the wood that Merlin, the magician, used, because the reason the word magician or magic is important is because these wise men, these three wise men were referred to as magi, the magi. Or he said magas, or even magus, M-A-J-U-S, right? Research this word, the magi or the magician. This is where Merlin, but again, in those times, you had agreeable and disagreeable magi, because these magi were also referred to as the Essenes, the elders. This is where these three wise men were part of the Essene order, which Jesus or Yeshua, the first one, remember I said there are three, Yeshua, the son of Gabriel and Mary, his name was Yeshua. Yeshua, he belonged to the order of the Essenes, and so did John the Baptist. And these people and these three wise men, who I'm going to give you their names. So you had Jasper, Balthasar, and Melchior, right? These three wise men, they were a part of the Essenes. The order of Essenes were strict, and they had very strict spiritual practices. They lived in communities by themselves. They did and worked for and by each other. They had many trades. They studied what you would call astronomy, right? Which became astrology, right? Because this all ties into this, what we're talking about with the wise men. So you got astrology, right? Which they're saying is the studies of the stars. But really, it's a pseudoscience from astronomy. And this goes into the differences between worshipping the moon and worshipping the sun, which is lunar, we say lunar, because lunar, even though it relates to the moon, so we say lunar astrology, but lunar also ties into the word lunatic, because it's a lunatic state of mind, right? As opposed to astronomy, which deals with astrobiology, which is really solar biology. That's what astronomy is, meaning that when you say solar, you're dealing with the sun. Because suns are what? Stars, And there are different types of stars, and I am going to go through the different types of stars, because it ties into the real Jesus being born June, June the 26th, right? Not December the 25th. And it ties into things that took place on June the 26th, which I'll come back to. So you got two sides. Remember, we always teach about agreeable and disagreeable. You will always have the two sides. Like we spoke about the golden children, then you got the fire children. You will look at either Elohim, you're dealing with Yah, and you're dealing with Way, agreeable, disagreeable, or cherubim and seraphims, So this is all building up to this whole difference between the lunatic state of mind dealing with astrology, which was considered to be sorcery. And this is what Merlin, the magician, was practicing until this day. Merlin, right, uses the holly, the wood that he uses in his, what they call his wand, to cast spells and to bamboozle people, right? And that's kind of what Hollywood does, because what does Hollywood try to do? To make people become stars, So everybody that wants to become a star, that's chasing this dream, which is really an illusion dealing with this lunar astrology, because people they use the zodiac, because a lot of people swear by the zodiac, and a lot of these celebrities, these stars that want to get their star on the walk in Hollywood, they deal with zodiac, and zodiac comes from the word zoo, yeah, animals and the zoo, right? So when you look at that zodiac comes from something in ancient Egypt, which they stole on from the solar biology side, known as the dendera, yeah. And the dendera was dealing with this solar biology, and we dealt with astronomy because the elders, these elders that were part of the Essenes, they were monitoring and waiting for the birth of this being, which was what we would call an ila mutajasid, right? Or a being that is incarnating onto the planet. And by studying the movements of the planetary bodies, etc., they were charting and waiting for the birth of this child that we're talking about, known as Yeshua. The second one was the son of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, whose name was Cleophas. Okay? The third one was the son of Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, and he was known as Bar Jesus. Bar Jesus. Okay? This is why, in terms of this child being born and the three wise men coming and people getting confused about these three Jesuses, because when you translate Bar Jesus, it's actually saying son of Jesus. And when you look at the three of them, they would have been considered God, right? Because Cleophas, because Cleopatra was Egyptian and she was royalty, and also Mark Antony was a Greek god, he was saying he's the son of God. And then you have Bar Jesus, his son Yeshua was also God, and so he was saying he's the son of God. And both of them, Cleophas, they traveled around, and they went to like India, they went to, different parts of the world teaching, Cleophas got involved with like the Kabbalah, and he was known like in different parts, like St. Isa. That's why sometimes you have people in India that will tell you that Jesus was there, because again, when they got unalived, they were kept there and then moved to the Vatican and then eventually moved again. So their three stories are merged together when you're reading the Bible, because in one part you're hearing the story of the real one, Joshua, and in another part they're mixing the stories up. But yeah, it's a lot. We're gonna piece it all together, and so when you're dealing with this Nimrod and his mother, this is where you get the statue of the Black Madonna from, because she made that story up, and then the Black Madonna, because again, the Pope, a lot of people talk about the Pope worshipping the Black Madonna. We're going to show you images of these things. So the Black Madonna is the woman with the baby and child, which ties back into the original story of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, right? Obviously, in the original tones, we would say Osir or Asar or Asaru, right? That would be who becomes Osiris in Greek mythology, because a lot of the stories are copied, all right? So then Isis or Ashtaroth, because she was known again by different cultures, different names, because that whole Madonna and child, going back to Isis and Horus, again, Horus becomes Horus in Greek, but if you go back, you're dealing with Haru, or Hiru, as some people will pronounce it, because really it's just the phonetics and the language from different places, just like even the word Yanun, right? Because Yanun is also a being that's referred to as an Ila Mutajasid, or an avatar. An Ila Mutajasid is a being that's incarnating here in the flesh. Be very careful of the technology in terms of using Christmas, because all that stuff to do with Father Christmas, the reindeers, the turkeys, buying all these, stuff you don't really need. and just being like greedy and gluttonous for that period. That's all dealing with this side of the manufacturing and to make you spend your dollars. And that's dealing with 6 ether, dealing with the lower vibration, whereas the other side is dealing with 9 ether and so on and so forth, all right? So these magus or magi, they even, like I said, John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist was a part of the Essenes, and he's important because obviously he ushered in the coming of this being, and he was the one that baptized him in the Jordan, and obviously to start his whole legacy of his mission. And they tell you that John the Baptist, he was living in the wilderness and he ate locusts. And again, when you hear the word locust, people automatically think about, you know, the insects of locusts, but there's a locust plant. Again, you can research this. The locust plant is what they were eating because it was very good. The Essenes were like vegans and vegetarians. They didn't eat meat. They were living, you know, very spiritual, and they basically work for and of each other. All right, so when you're dealing with this astrology, because we're going back to these 3 wise men following a star to come and find this child, they tell you that these 3 wise men were from Persia. So these 3 wise men, Balthasar, Jasper, and Melchior. Balthasar, he brought gold, because gold is obviously symbolic of royalty, wealth, and so this was the gift that he was bringing. Then you had Jasper, he brought frankincense, and then Melchior, he brought myrrh. So they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, all right? Now, during this time of the birth, you also had the king called King Herod, right? Herod was the person that was ruling at the time. And Herod worked for Caesar, okay? And during this time, Caesar, oh yeah, the Essenes were, they were given a blight by Herod, because if you know about his whole story, they were like, when he was a child, they predicted and told him, because these magi or Essenes, because they're very knowledgeable in the scriptures and they, you know, they studied the stars and so on, they were able to tell him that he was going to become a powerful leader in the future. So when he was a child, so when it actually happened, when he became that king, he remembered what they said to him. So he kind of left them alone. But during this time, Caesar, because they were collecting taxes, right? Or no, there was a, what did they call it? A census, yeah? A census where they were counting the people, right? And this is one of the reasons why, you know, Jesus was also traveling, because at that time, everyone had to come and be counted. Why were they being counted? A census was to know how many people were there so that they can tax them. Because, you know, Caesar was about his money. It was about the taxation. Until this day, we still get censuses. You know, people want to, they send you through the post and that to count and see who's around. So the census was to find out how much people were around so that he can tax them. So during that time, he heard about this new child that was being born. So if you remember the story, he couldn't go and find this child himself. So what he did was, he heard about these 3 wise men coming into his you know, his domain, and he was like, he wanted to speak to them, and obviously they were coming trying to find this child. And when they arrived, he summoned them and asked them and made a deal with them to tell him when they find this child. But like I said, because he respected them, because they were the ones that had told him that, you know, he was gonna be this great person in the future, and when it came to pass that it was, he respected them, and he was like, okay, cool, go and find this child, and then when you do, come and let me know. But what he had an ulterior motive because he really wanted to kill this child because, he got wind of the prediction of this new child that's going to be, king of the Jews and so forth, right? So they went and they were following, according to the story, they're following this star. The star led them to where the child was being born. Now, I said I was going to read something from the book, The Wisemen, because it explains and talks about a little bit about stars, because people need to know and understand how stars behave. And this scroll goes back a very long time as well, all right? Okay, so let me read a little bit from this, and I'll show you the picture of the wise men. You've got Jasper, Balthasar. I'm going to read and then build up to that part where I'm talking about the stars and then how it relates and ties into the child coming and so forth, right? So Parnababianun says here, many people are led to believe that the wise men came from Persia. This is because Persia was well known for being a base for mysticism. It was here that the bastard science of astrology achieved its height of popularity. I say this because it is a pseudo or false science stemming from the science of astronomy. This worship of the stars took place under the religion known as Zoroastrianism, right? Because remember, Zoroaster, he was who Abraham and his father Terah, they actually followed him, right? No, the wise men were not star worshippers, and they were not all from Persia, and they did not follow Zoroaster. Because that star, that's where you get Esther, and that's another name, Ashtaroth, that comes from that Esther. But let me carry on. The wise men were known by the titles of the Essenes, which is the Magi or the Hanif, the elders. In fact, each of the three wise men is one of the 24 elders, right? Remember when I showed the pictures of the 24 elders from the holy tablets, all right? So each Magi lived in a different community from the others. The Magi were a group of mystics known by many different names. They lived in communities set up all around the world, yet linked together as one. They were also from different schools of thought, which meant they were led by different masters. Like, for example, Melchior, he was also a student of Melchizedek, all right, who obviously Abraham was introduced to later on. Each of these masters taught a slightly different doctrine depending on where they were from. For example, the school of patience was something that the prophet Moses was to master, and you can find this in Quran chapter 18. So it goes on with the story of Herod. It says, during the reign of King Herod, the Essenes were excused from taking loyalty oaths, which all Judahites were obliged to vow, due to an incident in Herod's childhood where it was foretold that he would be a great ruler one day. So who were these three wise men? You had Balthasar, which means save the life of the king. And Balthasar was 45 BC to 49 AD. He was a Cushite descendant from Noah, the grandfather of Cush, who, as I mentioned before, is Nimrod's father. This tribe was situated in Ethiopia, which was where the tribes of Dan and Judah fled. Right? Remember the 12 tribes of Israel, they were destroyed except for the tribes of Judah, Dan and Judah, because they went south and the other tribes, they went north, and then they got wiped out. All right. So anyway, it goes on to say, this tribe was situated in Ethiopia, which was where the tribes of Dan and Judah fled to when they split off from the remaining tribes of Israel. Remember, the tribes of Dan and Judah went to the south, I just said that, and the other tribes went to the north of Africa. These tribes which journeyed to the north were the ones mentioned in 2 Kings. This is what I'm talking about. If you go to 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18, they were destroyed by the Most High. These tribes mixed in with the neighboring tribes and were mixed to extinction. Okay, so, but I'm going to skip that to go back to, this is the tribe which Balthasar was descended from. And again, you can find that in Kings 19:30. and he had students, all right? And then you had Jasper, which means treasurer. Jasper was from Persia. He was of a mixed seed and brought 4 of his students along with him also. And it gives the student's name. Then the third one, Melchior or Melchor, depending on how you pronounce it, which means a king of light. He was from the city of Midian. He was a student of Melchizedek, right? Which meant he was of a special order known as the Order of Melchizedek, or Amam, the ancient mystical order of Melchizedek, as it is called today. And Yeshua, Jesus of 2,000 years ago, he was also a part of as well. You can find this in Hebrews 5:5-6. The Midianites were descended from Abraham through his son, Midian, by his third wife, Keturah. Remember, Abraham had 3 wives, yes, Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. And this Keturah was the daughter of Nimrod and Unkeh, also known as Semiramis. Yeah, this is the Semiramis I was talking about, that was also Nimrod's wife as well as mother. Yes, people are going to say incest, but yeah, in that time, day and time, the laws that you're following today were not the ones that were being followed in that day and time. The Midianites were under the covenant of the Ishmaelites. Right? Remember Ishmael being also the son of Abraham and Hagar, the brethren of the Israelites. This is why Ishmaelites and Israelites are related. And sometimes, people think they're two separate, but they're related because of Ishmael and Hagar, and had not mixed their seed. So Jethro, also known as Shuab, and Ruel, the father-in-law of Moses, was also a Midianite. You can find that a Midianite, which you can find out in Exodus 18:1-2. It shows you a picture again shows you the picture of Nimrod, his mother Semiramis, and also a picture of Midian, son of Abraham and Keturah. He also was accompanied by his students. All right. It just goes on to talk about the different gifts that they brought, which I mentioned already, the gold signifying wealth. So here's a question. Once the wise men found the location of the birth of Yeshua, Jesus of 2,000 years ago, did they report it back to Herod? Because remember, I was saying that Herod, made a deal to say to them, oh, when you find this child, telling the 3 wise men, when you find this child, let me know so I can come and pay homage. But we know that he already had ulterior motives, because he wanted to actually execute them, because he was afraid of this child that's going to take over his kingdom. Yeah, so the question was, once the wise men found the location of the birth of Yeshua, Jesus of 2,000 years ago, did they report it back to Herod? And he says, before I give you the details concerning the birth of Yeshua, I must provide you with a little background of the events which surrounded this point in time. He says, Herod was the familiar name of a dynasty of princes who ruled from 55 BC to 93 AD, beginning with the patriarch Herod Antipater, if I'm pronouncing that properly. This lineage of Edomites, right, it says they're classified as Edomites who were subjugated and forced to accept Judaism by John Hyrcanus, who was a rebel in his era of time. They submitted to the laws of Mila Ibrahim, which is the rights of Abraham, which included things like, the circumcision, because, people still circumcise their children till today, which goes back to that Abrahamic right. He ruled principally in Judea, and they were not readily accepted by the Judahites, and there were many uprisings against them by the Judahites. Herod the Great, who we're talking about right now, from 67 BC to 9 AD. He was given the total rulership of Palestine, which included Jerusalem, by Julius Caesar. This is what I was saying before. Julius Caesar, who's sole ruler of the Roman Empire at the time. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, the rulership was seized by Mark Antony, right? The same Mark Antony that had the child with Cleopatra. Herod the Great then coerced Mark Antony into letting him keep his empire. He was partially successful, being that Mark Antony made gifts of several territories to Cleopatra, then famous queen of Egypt, which belonged to Herod the Great. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had a child named Cleophas, but because neither family would accept the other, Cleopatra was listed as the 10th wife of Herod to avoid a scandal. All right, you can read the whole of that in the Holy Tablet, chapter 15. This is the son that Cleophas, Mark Antony and Cleopatra's son. So after Mark Antony was defeated and committed suicide, his position was passed to his victor, Augustus Caesar, the nephew of Caesar, also known as Octavian, right, in 17 BC. So Herod the Great wasted no time in visiting the new ruler to plead for his portion of the kingdom which had been bestowed on Cleopatra. Augustus agreed to his petitions, and the residents of Judea were infuriated at the thought of being ruled by the lower class Idumeans again, not to mention they were enemies of ancient Hebrews. Herod the Great was forced to lay siege on the city of Jerusalem and successfully forced the inhabitants to accept. I'm gonna skip a bit because there's a lot to cover. Why were the wise men sent to the city of Herod when they were in search of Yeshua or Jesus? It says that because, remember, according to this Bible and scriptures and Quran, because God or Allah or Yahweh was not the one who caused the star to guide the wise men, it was the Elohim, right? Obviously, we have to upgrade a lot of the terms. So this was not a normal star. This is the point. It was this star was guided because it was stopping and moving and stopping and things like that. So the way Herod the Great learned of this birth was when a caravan reached his city, Jerusalem, during that time of taxation. Including in this caravan were the wise men who proceeded to inquire as to the whereabouts of the child. And you can read that in Matthew 2, verses 1 to 3. And this is when the census was being taken, as I said. So what was the great census taking? During this time, all residents of the territory of Palestine were ordered to return to the land of their birth so they could be easily counted at the time of taxing. This included Mary as well, the mother of Yeshua, Jesus, and her husband Joseph, who were making their way back to the town of Bethlehem. You can read that in Luke chapter 2, verse 4 to 6. Anyway, so this is why they were already heading in that direction. And remember that she was pregnant. I've already covered a bit where Herod was basically lying to say that he wants to come and pay homage to the child, but he had ulterior motives. So his plan was when they find him, they will let him know and then he will come and kill the child. But they betrayed him because their whole purpose, the three wise men, was to really confirm that this child was indeed the correct child or this avatar being that was coming here, because that meant a whole change. And that's a similar incident that's taken place with the master teacher coming, and he came obviously born again June 26, which is the same date in terms of this being. This is why a lot of people were confused during the school of religion in terms of, the Yeshua being born June 26 and Parna Babyanun being June 26, 1945, all right? Right, who are the Essene? And it says, remember, because the tablets were found, the Qumran tablets, right, which were a lot of the writings from, the Essenes. But let me carry on. The Essene followed the Levitical purity laws strictly and avoided contamination by the outside world. They received their laws from, Leviticus. The Essenes wrote part of the Sermon on the Mount called Beatitudes, or the blessed are they, Matthew 5, 3 to 16. They kept themselves isolated and lived for, of, and by each other. No one had individual property, and they all shared in the ownership rights. If one member visited another community, he or she was treated with utmost hospitality and concern. Their livelihood was sowing and planting. Some were herdsmen, beekeepers, writers, healers, using roots and herbs. Some worked as handicrafts. they raised the locust plant. This is what I was saying, because you hear the story that John the Baptist, the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, because if you look at his story as well, he was also an immaculate conception, right? But that's the story of Elizabeth in the Old Testament, which incidentally, if you read Psalms 22, that ties into the later crucifixion story or the cross-fixion story of Yeshua later on. Anyway, so they raised these locust plants, which was a part of their diet. This is the same locust which John the Baptist, 6 to 36 AD, ate in the wilderness. You can find that in Matthew 3:4 with wild honey. Yeah, because like I said, people confused locust and the locust plant. Okay, let me go to page 28 where it's talking about some of the Essenes were astrologers, meaning they were able to read signs from the stars, like the coming of a Messiah. They had their own stores, bakery, millinery, food, pottery, and a laundry which they supplied, manufactured, and earned salaries. After each member received their wages, they would purchase the necessities needed for their family, then donate the remainder to the community treasury. They shunned expensive luxuries. Some Essenes avoided marriage, but most of them didn't. The ones that married gave their wives 3-year probation and then waited until after 3 periods of purification. Yeah, they waited for their cycle, 3 periods, thereby giving proof of fertility, because they wanted to make sure that they were able to provide offspring. To have sexual intercourse with them, they did not spend a lot of time with their wives and only had sexual intercourse with them while they weren't pregnant, showing they weren't interested in self-indulgence, all right? Only for procreation. If any member of the order was sick, he or she was nursed back to health with care. The older members who were childless were treated as parents by all. Assistance was given when needed with discretion as well as compassion. To present gifts to one's relative was forbidden. If one was convicted of a crime, she became an outcast, immediately expelled from the order. Some were well versed in the scriptures and professed to tell the future. They were seldom, if ever, wrong in their predictions. The Essene is the order that is responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. So when we say the Qumran tablets, this is what we're talking about. That's the area where they were found. That helped to dispel the lies that have been fabricated in the Bible up until this day. They helped the Messiah Yeshua, Jesus, during his life. And as said earlier, they were there with the body of Judas, because I've got to come to that whole story of the story of Judas. They grew in power, and this angered Herod, which led to the attack on Masada, an Essene community, and led up to their suicide. They would not live under the rule of the Judahites. They put their tablets on scrolls and placed them in copper jars and buried them, and only to be discovered in 1947 AD in the Persian Gulf area. Now, scientists are using the translations to prove the Bible and the Bible and are continuing excavation. So since they found these tablets, which you can see right there, all right, these tablets told of many things that were left out of the Bible. And during the war, do you remember the Gulf War with Bush? A lot of them were destroyed. Most of them were destroyed in Iraq. Remember, Iraq is what we're calling ancient Sumer, or that Babylon area, right? Yeah, it says here. So during the Gulf War of 1990 AD, most of Iraq was destroyed because Iraq is on the site of old Babylon. Since the discovery of these scrolls, many mediums have discovered these scrolls and are tearing them into parts and selling the already fragmented pieces into parts on the black market for more than what would be considered reasonable, but the archaeologists are willing to pay. So it says, what was being translated from these pieces of these scrolls gives a clear meaning, and in some cases a different translation than what is already relayed in the English translation of the Bible. And then it goes on to talk about how they lived and what they practiced. Right, I'm going to skip that and go to the stars, right, which I was talking about. It says the star of the Wisemen. Upon sighting the heavenly sign of Hut, which is the astrological house of Hebrews, Balthasar, his students, and some travelers, as well as Jasper with his students, made their way to the city of Midian. Balthasar and Jasper were made aware that once they reached this city, Midian, another sign will be given to guide them to Yashua. Now, the journey from Ethiopia to Midian was 600 miles, and the journey from Persia to Midian was 650 miles. They picked up a large number of stragglers along the way, a number of soldiers, warriors, and visitors who were eager to meet the newborn child, accompanied the caravan to Midian. The majority of the people in the caravan traveled by camel because most of the journey took place across the desert. You know, camels are large, they got humps, they can last for, you know, for many, many hours and days without water. So they use the camels in terms of the travel. And again, I'm skipping. Let me talk about astrology for a little bit as it's building to the stars. So obviously they were following this star. It says that astrology, the star worship first received recognition by the ancient Babylonians. They resided in the area of what you know to be Iraq today. These Persian people were waywards from the religion taught by a man named Zoroaster. All right, that's in 660 to 583 BCE. And it says Zoroastrianism is the reformation of the belief of the Magi, right? So remember the Magi, their scenes, they were using solar biology and studying the stars. And the Magi dealt with science. But this pseudoscience known as astrology was a reformation of that, right? There were two groups of Magi, this is what I was saying before, where you have one that is positive and the other negative. And this is the negative one is where today you have like the zodiac signs, and because they were looking at reading the planets, but at that time they didn't have knowledge of all of the planets, so their predictions weren't really accurate. And even today, a lot of the predictions are still not accurate when you're going by the time of the Gregorian calendar and the fact that they didn't realize that there are more than 10 planets, because these groups, the negative ones, they thought there was only 4 planets that they could see. And then the modern ones said that there were only 10 planets. And they're wrong because there are actually 11 planets, because they didn't realize that Titan is the planet as well, all right? But let's keep going. So you have the negative and the positive. The agreeable or benevolent Magi were the ones that visited Yashua. These Magi were linked together as one through the order of the Essenes. The Essenes were very strict, observing daily prayers, foretelling the future, and being well learnt in the scriptures. The negative Magi, they claim to be mediators between the Creator and man, intervening in all sacrifices. They interpreted dreams and omens and claimed to be seers. Their exhibition of power made people enchanted with their incantations. As time passed, the Greeks labeled any sorcerer or person using methods of enchantment and incantations Magi. The negative Magi arose in the East at the time of Nimrod, right? This is what I was saying before. This person, Zoroaster, it was a Midianite. He was a Muslim by birth. He set out to reform a systematic and traditional form of Iranian polytheism in the 16th century BC. He formed his congregation and the Persians deemed him a prophet. And Zoroastrians are worshippers of the elements, fire, air, earth, and water, especially fire. This is why when you talk about Abraham being a worshipper of fire, because he was from that area known as Ur of Chaldea, and Ur means fire. He was a fire worshipper, and we have a actual fact called the god of light and fire, right? Because it ties into the origins of the monotheistic religions by way of Abraham being a Chaldean from Ur, and his father Terah. They both, followed the religion of Zoroaster. It was only later on when people claimed that he is a Hebrew because they use the word Hebrew, which comes from the word Ibri, when he crossed over the Tigris and Euphrates River, and they refer to him as an Ibri, or somebody that has crossed over. But anyway, they worship fire, air, earth, and water, especially fire. The only temples they had were fire temples. Zoroastrianism represents an original attempt made by Zoroaster at unity under the worship of one supreme creator. According to this teaching, Ahura Mazda, again, you have to research that, Ahura Mazda. Yeah, when you're researching Zoroastrianism, research Ahura Mazda, right? They look at him as the creator of the heaven and earth, i.e. of the spiritual and material world. He's surrounded by 7 entities who each represent the concept of Ahura Mazda. They are Holy Spirit, justice, truth, devotion, desirable, dominion, wholeness, and immortality. Zoroaster's ideology is based on the duel between good and evil, and that man's duty on the planet Earth is to choose which road he will take. They deal with, like your will, or what you have free will. The same thing that religion teaches today, where you say you have free will, or they say you have free will, but then you can only choose what they want you to choose, or you get punished, which is not free at all. Right, so I'm going to jump from the Zoroastrianism because it all ties into where Abraham and the whole religious schools come from. But what I do want to touch on to kind of start to round off, because it is a lot of information. You can always get the scrolls if you want to, get the full details. But when we're dealing with stars, stars are, obviously we say suns are stars, stars are suns. And when you study stars, you know that there are different types of stars. Like you have black dwarfs, white dwarfs, then you have novas, supernovas, giants, supergiants, and then you have neutron, where you get like the neutron bomb from. And, these stars go through a cycle. And what we're saying is that the star that they're telling you that the wise men were following could not have been a star like the stars I've just spoken about. And then you had comets. And comets, what are comets? Let me see. I'll tell you what comets are, because I'm going to explain to you what that star really was. So you have like meteorites and you have comets. Now, meteorites are stony metallic material of a meteoroid. Any of numerous celestial bodies ranging in size from specks of dust to asteroids, weighing thousands of tons, which appear as meteors when they enter the Earth's atmosphere. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And now let's talk about comets and how it relates to the master teacher, Parnabab Yanun. Comets are celestial bodies observed only in that part of its orbit that is relatively close to the sun, having a head consisting of a solid nucleus surrounded by a nebulous coma up to 1.5 million miles in diameter. A elongated curved tail arising from the coma when it's near to the sun, and thought to consist chiefly of ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, and water. The term used for most comets' travel is an elliptical or oval-shaped path. The length of time a comet takes to complete its orbit is known as its period. Some comets have periods of less than 7 years. Comets are considered a part of the solar system, since it never leaves the limits of the same system. There were many comets over the years that were popular in 1986, in 1664, but the one that I want to focus on is the one that is known as Comet Bennett, right, which made its appearance in 1970 AD. Remember, the master teacher, Parnabab Yanun, opened the 7th seal in 1970, which was it just says it here, the year of the opening of the 7th seal. In actuality, this was not a comet, but the appearance of the masters, extraterrestrial beings from other galaxies. Astronomers referred to the appearance of these brightly shine objects as comets out of ignorance because they didn't know. But this marked the arrival of the extraterrestrial known as Yanun, all right? And the fulfillment of a prophecy, which you'd have to read the Quran for that. Quran 86, 1 to verse 17. All right, but this part I do want to read because it marked the beginning of my awareness. This is a master teacher, Partner Bab Yanun, talking now, yeah? Dr. Malachi Z.K. York. It also marked the beginning of my awareness of who I was and what my job was to be. This was also the star that appeared on Tuesday, June the 26th, 1945 AD, at the birth in 1945 AD, like the birth of Yeshua, Jesus, right, which was in the year 7 AD. And that was marked by the appearance of a star. I am an extraterrestrial being, right, from another galaxy called Ilion. We have 19 galaxies. I am from the 8th planet known as Risk of the 19th galaxy, where there are also 19 livable planets. Riskians are human in appearance, and our complexion ranges from olive tone to dark reddish brown, and we are 7 to 9 feet tall, right? Yanun, also Yananan, the planet Risk has 3 continents. One that the native Riskians inhabit, that's called Cosmusta, meaning chosen black land. Another is called Zarantu, meaning visitor abode, and the other continent called Danuria, meaning dwelling of light. So when you look at the planet of Risk, it has these 3 continents, right? One of them is where the native Riskians reside, which is Cosmusta. The other one, which is Zarantu, is when visitors come. This is what happened when these reptilian beings that were fleeing, they came and they were given refuge to stay on Zarantu, but eventually they tried to take over and cause a war and so on, right? But this is Ilion with the planet Risk showing you the 3 suns, all right? Okay, the Riskians are the providers, and when Yanun came down, he came down with others, and the list, I won't, because of time, I'm just going to show you the list of the 23 elders, of which he's the 19th elder, and the 24th seat was left open for the prophets and whoever is in the new cycle, the new 24,000 year cycle when it starts again. It shows you the masters that came with him. So when he came, he says here, these are the 6 masters that came in 1970 AD, but, because people have asked this question in the past, where are the ones that came with him? He says, but they've returned to complete other missions. And those are Kadisin, Rizial, Mahai, Yanun, Yafafia, Sandalphon, also known as Sanenda or Yeshua. So these are the ones that that kind of came with him but went back for other missions. Even his name, Yanun, is referred to as Yi-Nun, Yanan, Yinan, Yanan, Yinun, Yenun, and Yenan, because of the different pronunciations from different people in different galaxies. Yeah, that whole story about Bennett being his comet, because it wasn't really a comet, it was the elders coming, and who he is as Yanun. You know, you can read more of that, but I'm gonna just go back to what I was saying about an Ila Mutajasid, right? What is an Ila Mutajasid? It says an Ila Mutajasid is a being who incarnates at will on earth in the form of a mortal man when necessary to carry out the will of the party. This time we will say Parnatharu. He is an extraordinary being, the miraculous embodiment of the divine in human form. And Ilita Mutajasid comes in succession. One spirit incarnates into a person at birth, and as the person matures, the spirit within him dominates his body. This is what happened to me, that's Parnabab Yanun, once I reached the age of 25. I was visited as a baby in 1945 AD. Then in 1970 AD, I realized what my mission was. Yes, I am an Ilitamotajasid, an avatar. All right. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is round off and explain that these three wise men, they were being guided by a craft. As you go through this scroll, you'll find out about, the craft Nibiru, which doesn't come into our solar system because it's far too big and it can have a catastrophic effect on the other planets on our solar system, so it stays outside. However, there's a crystal city, which the Honorable Elijah Muhammad spoke about as the mother plane, that stays above the planet, and it has smaller crafts also called various names like crystal cities, Nibiru, and Shams, right? The Shams, one of them was actually spotted, right? This is the one that was spotted. There's a picture of it there, right? We can show you the footage of that. But it was spotted in the Gulf breeze in Florida. And you can read all about the crystal city in Revelations 21 and 22. And so, yeah, it was not a comet. It was the master Yanun coming in 1945. And it was not, and 1970, he explained, and it was not a star that these three wise men were following, but rather crafts that guided them to find this special being called an Ila Mutajasid, which is an incarnated being that comes at a particular period to bring about a new beginning, a new cycle. There's so much more to go into it. The whole story about the crucifixion, because we are in that time that people are referring to as Christmas, because remember that whole story was a fiction. For those who don't know, the real Jesus, he was afraid because he went into the garden to pray and asked if it'd be possible for the cup to pass from him, and he received, help, and he was able to transfigure, right? Transfiguration is the ability to, what people will call shapeshift any object. And so Judas was the one that was transfigured to look like him. Because when you go back to the garden, when he went to pray, the other disciples, they fell asleep. When the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, the army at the time, they came to find him. They didn't even know who Jesus was. So they were like, who is he? And then it tells you in the story that he said it was him. But when they stepped to him, they fell back, and then there was confusion. In that process, Judas was transfigured to look like him. They took Judas thinking that they had the real one, and Judas was the one that was crucified on the cross, according to the story. Now, the Essenes, who were the brotherhood that Jesus belonged to, they knew what had taken place. So, because the Sabbath was coming, they agreed to go and they asked if they could remove the body because they knew that the transfiguration was going to go back. So they took him, right, and then put him into the cage, and then they basically made it look like he hung himself, because remember, in that story, they told you that Judas went off by himself and hung himself, but who was recording it? These Essenes knew the secret, so they then took him off after people witnessed it and saw that he was hung on the tree. They were like, oh, he went away and hung himself. Then they dropped his body from the rock, and he dismangled, so people could not really recognize who he was, because then when Mary Magdalene went to look in the cave for Jesus, found who? A gardener. It was dressed like a gardener because he was disguised now, because the transfiguration had worn off with Judas, so they made it look like Judas hung himself. They dropped him off to dismangle himself. Then the real Jesus was smuggled. He met back with the Essenes, and they had a plan to say that, you know what, Mary Magdalene saw him, he said, why do you look for the living amongst the dead? And then he told her, like, I am not dead, but go and tell them that I am, because then that will keep him basically undercover. And then they met and planned, and they were able to kind of like smuggle him by way of France, because you also had the real Knights of Templar that knew what had taken place in the secret. They smuggled him with his children, and they were in France, and then eventually made their way into Egypt, where he lived for the rest of his days to be 120 years old. And when you look at the description of Jesus in the Bible, like I was saying, today you're getting everybody now trying to reveal who Jesus is, and saying maybe it was black, is a black Jesus, because the truth is coming. And the description of Jesus in the Bible is that he's got hair like lamb's wool, which is an afro, right? His feet were like burnt brass. If you ever take brass and burn it, you see that it turns black. So Jesus could not run to Egypt and hide, being, you know, a Caucasian or a European in a country that is full of black people, because you would stand out. The master teacher broke down to us many years ago that the real Jesus or Yeshua of the Bible was black. So now that everybody's saying it in 2024, go back and read the information he put out from the 1970s and so forth, right? So that's not new to us. The other two, obviously Mark Antony being mixed with Cleopatra, will give you that more caramel looking that other people will say he looked like, which is, as I said, having the different stories. Then you've got the other one, who, yes, is the son of Mary and Jesus anyway, the Yeshua, and he would look black. So no matter how you look at it, yeah, Jesus is black, and now it's becoming common news. But, you know, at the end of the day, the wise men were students that knew what was happening. They were guided with a craft to go and make sure that this child was indeed this divine incarnation. And yeah, so you have the true story and you have the fake story, and you have fake Christians and you have real Christians. And anyone who's seeking the truth in today, you have to come over to Wu Sabat, because that's the real truth from all the religions. And you have to now know that the being that has come now, who is exactly who you're calling the Messiah, the anointed, all right? You have, again, disagreeable and agreeable. You have the anointed that is known as the anointed cherub, right? Which is dealing with the false Christ, who is Nana. And then you have the real anointed, or the real Messiah, that is here and is spreading this good news of Wu Sabat. And yeah, I hope you now have a full breakdown of the Wisemen, and that it's not about Christmas and these pagan rituals that have weaved their way into what people are celebrating today, not realizing that, you know, it goes back to this whole story of St. Nicholas, Santa, which is really Satan, dealing with the whole demonic side of the industry, that it's really about getting into your pockets. And so, yeah, until the next time, we want to say Tawukum, Wu Wadu.